Hello, my name is Andrew Berry. I lecture at Harvard University and I have occasion most years to visit Savannah University. It's my privilege to teach here too in evolutionary biology and to give some lectures, and this is the December 25 lecture which, as you can see, is on humans, the greatest evolutionary force in history. So obviously there's quite a lot to talk about here. I'm going to break it down into several broad categories, starting off with the deep history of humans. So I've entitled that Humans as Super Predators. Obviously, we're pretty damn good at destroying the environment, inflicting pain, suffering, and indeed the need to evolve upon our fellow species at the moment. We're ever more efficient at destroying the environment, at devastating forests, trashing landscapes, and so on. But what I want to start with pointing out is the destructiveness of humans in the natural world did not start with the Industrial Revolution or machinery or whatever you choose. It started with the genesis of us, Homo sapiens. So this is a reminder. We evolved in Africa. We don't know exactly when, but I'm going to give a somewhat arbitrary date of 300,000 years ago. And then headed out of Africa. So this is a sort of broad scale plot of humans moving out of Africa. So out of East Africa into the Middle East, then around the Indian Ocean to Australia. So you can actually follow the migrations around here. Into Eurasia, into Europe, and then very late in the day into the New World, into North America and South America. Controversial, but I'm going to put a figure of 15,000 years ago, which by evolutionary standards is approximately yesterday. And then very late in the day, you've got the colonization. This is really in historic times. The colonization of the Pacific, the Polynesians, and indeed the movement across the Indian Ocean to Madagascar. So that's the context. Now, let's think back to probably, I'm going to, again, somewhat arbitrarily designate the date, 80,000 years ago. 80,000 years ago, here's a group of our ancestors heading out of Africa, wondering, needless to say, what will befall them as they head into the unknown. And what famously befell them was a lot of very large, quite often quite woolly mammals. So they met the woolly mammoth. They met multiple woolly mammoths. What magnificent animals these were. And they were big animals, needless to say. We all know that. There are other woolly things, also kind of big, also probably rather ornery. This is the woolly rhino. And it wasn't just herbivores out there that were big and rather threatening, but the predators out there were big and rather threatening. This is a saber-toothed tiger. There were several species. The one in the skeleton here is actually a scimitar-toothed tiger. So that was largely in the old world, basically. So this is a sort of panoply of what our ancestors encountered as they traveled out of Africa. But what about when they got to other places? So in South America, remember, a much later arrival. This is the ground sloth megatherium. This was a stupendous animal, just enormous. And again, we've got a scale bar here. It stood higher than an African elephant. This was a serious piece of mammalian real estate. Let's go to Australia. A wombat, well, a wombat is normally about that size. This is the extinct Diprotodon, the monster wombat of the past, the giant wombat. And just to give you a sense of quite how large it was, here's a scale replica on display in the Australian Museum. This was a stupendously large animal. Okay, well, what happened to all these animals? Well, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? They're not with us anymore. They went extinct. So here's a synopsis, a fairly recent synopsis of very large mammals, and I can't remember the exact threshold that they required of body size, but these are big things. And today we have on the planet 11 such species, and we've lost, and this is lost in the last 50,000 years or so, 46 species. It's pretty sobering. Now, so the question, of course, now arrives, and I've set it up in a way that the answer is also kind of obvious. Where did they go? What happened to them? Well, it's strangely controversial, actually, because it seems pretty straightforward to me. But one pretty dead-on cert, so far as I can see, is that humans were responsible. Homo sapiens drove the megafauna, as it's often called, to extinction. Three nice pieces of data to support this contention. The first is what I'm calling selectivity. This is actually a rather magnificent plot of 65 million years of body size evolution in mammals. Starting off, why 65 million years ago? Because that is when the dinosaurs disappeared. Remember, that's when the rock fell out of the sky and hit the dinosaurs on the head. Now, why is that a significant moment in mammalian evolution? Because it permitted mammals to get bigger. So mammals and dinosaurs had coexisted on the planet for more than 100 million years, a long period of time prior to the so-called impact, the bolide impact of 66 or 65 million years ago. And during that time, dinosaurs famously got stupendously big-toothed and everything else. Mammals took the let's be discreet route. They tended to be much smaller, they tended to live in burrows, live underground, or be nocturnal. In other words, they were small, discreet, and keeping out of the way of the reptilian overlords. And that might sound a little science fiction-y. It's not, actually. The point is the ecological niches for large organisms were filled by the dinosaurs, which means that there was no available ecological space, so to speak, for smaller organisms, namely the mammals. So only with the elimination of the dinosaurs could mammalian evolution diversify into those large body size niches. And that's what you see in this plot. The black line is the general trend in body size increase post-dinosaur disappearance. The different colors are by continent. Don't worry about that too much. What I want to highlight is, whoa, something weird happened at the very end of the story. Let's zoom in to look at that a bit closer. So we're looking at here, and now this is a new, on the left is just a simplified version of the full 65 million year picture that we looked at before. Then on the right, what we've done is zoomed in to the relevant period, the recent period. We're looking at basically the last 50,000 years or so. What do we see? Well, we see a significant drop off in average size of surviving fauna. Things are indeed getting smaller. We can quantify this thusly. This is kind of cool, actually. I think it's a beautiful illustration. This has divided mammals up into, 7 size classes, starting very small and ending very large. And to ask a simple question, how many of the smalls survived and how many were extinct? How many of the not quite so small survived and went extinct, and so on? And notice, if you look at the smallest mammals, we find 3,705 species in the fossil record. 27 of those have disappeared. For the mega mammals, we've got 48, of which 40 have disappeared. That's really spectacular. In other words, what we're dealing with, this is not just a general mammalian extirpation. It's a highly selective process, and it's taking out the big boys. Now, this second plot down here has the same 7 categories for each individual one, but now we've passed it into separate continents. This is really interesting, actually, Notice in Africa, there hasn't been that much extinction. Africa has handled it pretty well. Eurasia hasn't done too badly. The epicenters of extinction, especially of big things at the right-hand end of these plots, is Australia and the Americas, North and South America. Now, what's going on here? Well, this is conjectural, but the idea here, and I think it's a nice idea, is that humans evolved in Africa. Also, we moved out, starting about 2 million years ago. There were pre-Homo sapiens species, Homo erectus, for example, moved out of Africa and colonized Eurasia. So Africa is, if you like, co-evolving. The mammals in Africa are evolving in concert alongside the humans. The mammals in Eurasia had a good taste of what humans were like and also underwent a fair bit of co-evolution, if you like, alongside the early hominins in Eurasia. It's the three places that had been previously uncontacted by ancestral humans, namely Australia, namely North and South America, that got hit the hardest. So this is when something completely alien life form, life force, Homo sapiens arrives. These faunas were completely unprepared to deal with that, and hence the enormous effectiveness of the destructiveness of our ancestors. We can quantify this further into a metric of body size selectivity in extinction. I won't go into the details. I just want you to get a general sense that we're dealing with a highly size selective process in these recent extinctions. This again is the entire Cenozoic record, so that's the last 65 million years. I think it's been passed into million-year slabs. And the researcher will ask a simple question. How heavily is the probability of going extinct affected by your body size? And obviously, there might be a high probability, as there was over here, of going extinct if you were small, or if you're over here, a high probability of going extinct if you're large. What I want you to draw your attention to is the period we're most interested in is the late Quaternary, LQ here. So you've got it over here, you have an enormous selectivity in favor of the extinction, or a higher probability extinction, of large organisms. So it looks like somebody's been choosing what to drive to extinction. And yes, humans look at a large animal, there's one, and that is not just a quick snack, it's not even just lunch, that's breakfast, lunch, dinner for as long as you can eat, I would say. So selectivity makes sense. These are large, high profile, high yield targets. The second factor that I want to talk about which sort of clinches it as humans as a guilty party, is the timing. And this is sort of the obvious one. The point being is essentially when humans arrived, that's when you see the extinction. And the good news is that the human diaspora throughout the planet, as we've seen, was not simultaneous. So you have different arrival times in different places. Do we see different times of extinction? And the answer is yes. This is especially beautifully illustrated, actually, if we look away from the mammal record and look at the monster bird record. Because monster birds went extinct very recently, so recently that we can date those disappearances with great confidence. There's always going to be a big error bar if we're dealing with a deep prehistorical extinction point, but a much smaller error bar if we've got a relatively recent event. So let's travel to New Zealand. New Zealand, weirdly, this is just a quirk of biogeographic fate, doesn't have any major large mammals. So there's no goats, there are no cows, there's no antelopes, and yet there's plenty of food, plenty of vegetation to graze and browse upon. So that ecological opportunity has been taken up by these guys. These are the giant moas. a radiation of flightless birds in New Zealand, which were, as I say, effectively surrogate mammals. And these things thrived in New Zealand until, and it's about 1,000 years ago, again, not quite clear on the dates, but that's when the Polynesians arrived. So these are the first Maoris. And I mean, look at these things. If you are a hunter and you're hungry, this is a dream come true. Look at those drumsticks for a start. They're flightless. They're really completely unprepared to deal with the marauding super predator that just arrived in their midst. So it was literally in a couple of generations that these things were trashed. And just to remind you, these things were monsters. Here's a bunch of New Zealanders. These are tall guys. And that is just the pelvis and leg bones. We even lost the foot bones of this specimen. These things were stupendous. This is a famous photograph of the rather weird anatomist who first described them, a London-based Richard Owen. But again, that gives you a sense of the scale of these things. And this was such a spectacular ecosystem. This is the largest ever bird of prey. It's called Haast's eagle, that evolved in New Zealand to prey upon these moas. Quite the environment. And as I say, step one, humans arrive. Step two, these things are gone. And just to draw your attention to the fact these were pretty spectacular. But it wasn't just in New Zealand that you had these weird mega birds. This is the elephant bird, also extinct. This is in Madagascar, and again associated with the arrival of humans. The elephant bird is enormous, and also famous for producing the largest known egg. Just a spectacular thing. One of the curious things about Madagascar, even though all of human evolution was occurring, if you like, in mainland Africa, Madagascar is just, a little off to the right, you might say. It was isolated from all early hominin evolution, and in fact only colonized. It's, again, dates are debated, but I'm going to plump for sort of 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And curiously enough, originally by people traveling across the Indian Ocean from Southeast Asia. So the original colonists didn't come from Africa, but from Southeast Asia. And they, again, made hay. There were giant lemurs that went extinct, and indeed the elephant bird. So the timing is pretty compelling, that when humans arrived, the local megafauna was in trouble. And as I say, humans have even recorded this. This is actually rather lovely, isn't it? A drawing of a mammoth in cave art dating to 15,000 years ago. And so here is another breakdown of the big guys, when they were lost and what proportion were lost. Again, I draw your attention to the fact South America, North America, and Australia are much more extincty, so to speak, than the more experienced, for want of a better term, faunas in Africa and Asia. And all this is making the point is that human arrival and extinction are indeed correlated. And this is a redrawing of the map that I showed you earlier, but we've included, so get to Africa 40 to 60,000 years ago, we've included what went and were extinctions. So here's our ground sloth in South America. Okay. The third and final argument in favor of a human mediation megafaunal extinction is kind of a cool one. It turns out that these species, the megafauna species, did not all die out at once. So mammoths largely had gone by around 10,000 years ago. So that's continentally, at least, or on mainland continents, mammoths were gone by 10,000 years ago. But that was not true everywhere. There were two islands. A major island, in fact, is one of them, north of Siberia. This is in the middle of nowhere, and here the mammoths hung on. Why? Because humans hadn't made it to the island. The island itself is inaccessible and remote, not to mention absolutely inhospitable. So mammoths had, if you like, a little mammoth preserve until eventually humans showed up. So let's visit that island. Here we are on the Sabanci compass. Oh, it's a long way away from Istanbul. It's a long way away from anything, actually. It's called Wrangel Island, and it's so remote that the man for whom it was named never even managed to make it there. So again, just to put it into context, there it is, off the north coast of Siberia. So yes, there the mammoths hung on. They went extinct, and this is a great illustration just to give you a sense of just how inhospitable Wrangel is. The mammoths hung on there until about 4,000 years ago. So there you have it. I think it's pretty clear that it was us, and so that drove the megafauna extinct. And I think there's an important take home here. Just to reiterate, it's not just modern us that is horribly destructive and so on to the environment. It's us in general, humans as a whole. And, you know, it's perfectly explicable why were we so focused on the megafauna, and why did they disappear at a higher rate than smaller things. The first comment is that it's in a way easier to render extinct a large animal. Large animals tend to have small population sizes because there's not enough food to feed too many of them, and they tend to have long generation times because it takes a lot longer to grow a very large animal than a rather small one. That makes them very vulnerable to extinction. If I kill off half a herd of elephants, it's going to take years and years to get back up in number. If I kill off half the population of mice, the next generation, they'll have recovered that because they reproduce so fast and have so many offspring. So yes, the relatively small population size again makes them especially vulnerable. So, you know, if you've only got 10,000 individuals to wipe out, that's a much easier task than wiping out 1 million. And finally, of course, yes, I've already said it, this is a 3-meal. This is a whole buffet package that we're looking at here. So it's a very high value. So yes, it might be a risky target to go after, but it's a high yield prospect. So I need hardly point out that there were very significant impacts on natural systems, on the natural world, of eliminating these big guys from the stories. So this is just a recreation of the impact in the Americas. You remove certain things and you have not necessarily catastrophic, but you're going to have a huge effect upon the entire ecosystem. And ecosystems are interrelated, complex houses of cards. You start pulling things out from the basement and all sorts of things are going to happen. And so these, again, just difficult scenarios here. This is the tropical Americas. We've got rid of the ground sloth and this glyptodon, which is this enormous armadillo, relative, right? Kind of a cool thing. And what do you have instead? Very different ecosystems. And if they're very different ecosystems, how do plant and animal systems adapt? Through natural selection. Finally, in Australia, there were giant kangaroos, bigger than any kangaroos we have today. We've lost the mega wombat that we talked about earlier. And again, the consequences are substantial and significant. Okay, good. I hope I've convinced you that we've been at it for a while. Let's talk right away about whether we can actually observe direct evolutionary responses. By direct, I mean we're hunting something. Does it evolve in response to that? So in other words, we are directly placing the selection pressure on the animals in question. And we can stick with elephants, actually, and their relatives. We've been talking about mammoths and so on. This is a rather sobering image. This is elephant hunting, which, as you know, these days is not really done for food, but for ivory. This is actually a picture from wildlife of Kenya, I think, they've impounded these these are poached elephant tusks. There's money in elephant ivory, and that is the selective pressure on elephant populations. Having said that, obviously this is a depressing spectacle, but having said that, we're pretty good these days at protecting elephant populations. They're in national parks. They're parks patrolled to protect them from poaching. This is not to say that poaching doesn't occur, but it's not that systematic or that dramatic, except sometimes. So this is a study, this is kind of a cool study, fairly recent, on the evolution of tusklessness in African elephants. Now, the point is this, it's simple. If I'm a poacher and I've got two elephants standing in front of me, one has got a nice big set of tusks on it and the other has no tusks whatsoever, which one am I going to kill? Easy, the one with tusks. What does that mean? It means that the one without tusks is the one that's going to reproduce, and if the tusklessness is genetically encoded, that's going to be passed on to the next generation. So it's just natural selection, right? Natural selection in favor of tusklessness. And this study took advantage of a slightly demoralizing but interesting natural experiment. This was a population of elephants in a national park in Mozambique called Gongarosa. And it was a sort of normal, well-defended, well-protected park until the Mozambique Civil War. That led to a breakdown of law and order from 1977 to 19... So it's a 15-year period, and the park ceased to be a park, basically. So the elephant populations were still there, but they're no longer protected. And you've got impoverished, heavily armed people wandering around. This is the nature of civil wars, right? And one way to deal with the impoverishment, of course, is to get your hands on some ivory and sell that on the international markets. And that's not that difficult to do because you're carrying a machine gun. So there was very substantial devastation. So you'll see the population pre-Civil War was 2,500 individuals. It's gone down to, 100 individuals by the end of the war. I mean, it's really catastrophic. The other thing I want you to note is this. These pie charts show the tusk status of these animals. So dark blue is having two tusks. You're a normal elephant. Now, so the point is, even before the war, there were tuskless. So 18.5% of animals were tuskless, and you've got some one-tuskers. Now, that's a bit dodgy. It's possible that that's just through accidents and so on. But we do have a low proportion, so nearly 70% of two-tusked elephants and nearly 20% of tuskless. Now, post-Civil War, those frequencies have changed massively. So we're up to over 50% of tusklessness and 41% of two tusks. Now, notice that since started to come back, presumably because it's a good idea to have two tusks if you're an elephant. So you are at a mild disadvantage having no tusks, but at a significant advantage if you're being machine gunned en masse for your ivory. So, okay, so this is the demographic data. The cool thing is that you can then go and do some modern genomic style genetics. And I'm not going to deal with the details whatsoever here. What these are, this is the X chromosome where there were a priori reasons to suggest that something interesting might be going on. What we've done is sequence the DNA of a large number of tuskless individuals, sequence the DNA of a large number of tusked individuals, and pretty much literally play spot the difference. And it's in the purple regions that significant differences have occurred, are observed, I should say. And amongst the genes in those regions, so this is just looking along the genome and identifying the genes, something called AMLX, which is familiar to dentists, curiously enough. So this is a gene that is known from human problems, dental problems. So it's if you've got a functionless AMLX gene, you've got a condition called amelogenesis imperfecta, which leads to all sorts of tooth problems. In other words, you need a working copy of this gene to have good teeth. Reminder, tusks and elephant are just overdeveloped teeth. So what we have here is a gene which is messed up in elephants, which when it's messed up in human, messes up teeth. It's kind of cool. So what we have, this is actually a more complex analysis involving two different genes, but we do, and I'm not saying this is necessarily exactly what happened, but and it's not exactly a smoking gun, but what we do seem to have had is strong natural selection in favor of tusklessness. There was a mutation in AMLX and maybe in a couple of other genes which effectively promote tusklessness, or at least the elimination of some of the components of the tooth. And so we've had natural selection in favor of that. We've seen that increase in frequency under the machine gun era. And now, because you do actually still want to have two tusks if you're an elephant, that's swinging back there's no longer a very significant disadvantage to having tusks. So that's natural selection in response to direct human predation, for want of a better term. I wanted to add to this something which I think is curious and interesting. What we're talking about with the tusks is genetic evolution. So we've identified the mutations, as you saw, which have created changes. So this is canonical natural selection. It's changing the frequency of the mutations over time, courtesy who survives and who reproduces. This is a study from the same set of elephants in Gongarosa, which is documenting non-evolutionary changes, learned changes. So you might call these cultural changes. Cultural changes are what you acquire from your family or from TikTok or whatever it is. Things that affect you, which obviously aren't affecting your genome. And it's actually, I just think this is kind of cool. And I think it's a tribute in a way to the sensitivity of elephants. There is evidence, and this is strictly a human psychological condition, of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. So this famously is what affects, well, it was, I think, first identified in World War I, when the soldiers in the trenches or in Turkey on the beaches of Gelibolu were traumatized and psychologically damaged by the appalling experiences they had. It seems the same is true in elephants. So they have documented changes in behavior, more belligerence, and it's all transmitted within a group. So a group behaves in a fairly defined way because the young elephants are learning how to react, say, to another vehicle from the older elephants. So in these elephant populations, we're seeing genetic responses to the Civil War period. That's evolution. But we're also seeing what you might call psychological and or cultural evolution to this response in terms of their behavior. Okay, that's direct. Most of what we do in terms of our environmental damage is indirect. So let's talk briefly about indirect impacts on natural populations and how they're responding. I'm going to start with pollution. And here I'm going to dip into a classical moment in the history of evolutionary genetics. This is the textbook example of natural selection in action. So apologies if you're already familiar with it, but it is a cool example. And it results actually weirdly from a British obsession, I'm British I should explain, British obsession with collecting things. So British people, for reasons best known to themselves, have been collecting moths, butterflies for a long period of time. And in particular, this is one species, Biston betullaria. It's a fairly regular moth. And you can find two forms of it. One is this light speckled form called the typica form. Now notice that on a regular just plain bark tree stands out like a sore thumb. That moth is saying to a passing bird, look at me, eat me. Now you put that same moth You can't even see it. Look at it. That's fantastically camouflaged. This is on a lichen background on a similar tree, okay? And it's extremely well camouflaged. Now, you compare that to this form, the melanic form, which is virtually indiscernible on the dark tree background, but when it's on the light licheny background, it's very obvious. If you look at an early collection, say from 1750 of moths in England, you don't see the dark form. You only see the light form. Okay, the dark form either didn't exist or was so rare that it never cropped up in collections. If you now scroll forward in time to say 1850, so where the Industrial Revolution is getting underway. The Industrial Revolution, of course, means lots of environmental pollution, lots of, think of smoke spewing out of factory chimneys, and that smoke is basically, its main damage is not, it's depositing soot, yes, but it's also poisoning the lichen. So this isn't an unhealthy tree here, it's just that it's bereft of lichen. The lichen has been killed by the toxic fumes, like sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, so we're getting a very clear change in terms of the background on which these moths can spend the day. Remember, they're flying at night and spending the day trying to avoid being eaten by birds. 1850, mid or early Industrial Revolution, you see a mix of the dark and light form. But then if you go forward to, say, 1950, it's all dark, and you're sampling in a city area, it's all dark form. It really is the dominant form. And you can see that this isn't over time, this is over space, this complex plot. You've got geography along the x-axis here. So this is quite a large piece of real estate. We're starting in North Wales and moving east into the industrial heartlands of England, including Liverpool and Manchester. Today we think of them as mainly as places where they play football, but in the old days they were the big industrial, or two of the biggest industrial cities in Britain. Now what's happening here is the wind is blowing west-east, okay? So this is countryside. It has low levels of pollution and therefore low levels, the vertical axis is the frequency of the dark form. This has low levels of the dark form. But once we hit the threshold of industrialization, and remember all the wind is moving in this direction, the frequencies go up and stay up. And people have done experiments, I won't dwell on it, to show that there is a significant disadvantage of being light, let's say, in a dark environment, and disadvantages of being dark in a light environment. So this clearly is a response to an indirect human pressure. Humans have generated pollution and the moth population is evolving accordingly. The cool part of this story is there is a final twist, which is come the 1960s, the government of Britain realized that they were, because remember, they're not just poisoning lichens, they're poisoning children, among other things, that something had to be done about the dirty air. So Clean Air Acts were passed in Parliament, and there was a ban on burning coal fires and so on and so forth. Basically, the pollution problem went away. And we got this data, this is from Manchester, so one of those very urban cities that we looked at before. If you came in 1960, and sampled the moths there, 95% of them were the dark form. And then you've kept sampling. Now, beyond about 2005, you don't find these. We're back to the pre-industrial revolution situation where all the moths are like this. Okay, the nice thing about this finally is that we've been able to again do some genetics on it, and it seems there's a transposal element. So this is a piece of DNA, essentially a mobile piece of DNA in genomes that has parked itself in a particular gene in the light form, which prevents it from producing the light type pigmentation. So again, we understand the genetic basis of this response to natural selection. Climate change. This is obviously a big one. Climate change is affecting every species on the planet. And yes, as you know, this is, at least in part, human generated. So I'm just going to take a couple of examples here because these illustrate this isn't a response under natural selection, but it is an important evolutionary response. Let's travel to the far north. Here, polar bears in their natural habitat on the ice floes of the Arctic. Today, however, courtesy climate change, those ice floes are not as extensive as they used to be, and the polar bears are therefore forced to adopt sort of what you might call new hunting strategies. So here is a rather sad and depressed looking polar bear with muddy feet in, I think, Churchill, Manitoba in northern Canada. So the polar bears are forced by climate change to move south because of the loss of ice. And their close relative is a grizzly bear. These live in the boreal temperate forests of North America. And these, because climate change is making the possibility of them foraging further north, are moving north. So we have a situation where the polar bears are moving south and the grizzly bears are moving north. So normally, or historically, these two species have not met. Polar bears up there, grizzly bears down there. Now, however, they're actually meeting. What happens? Well, they're still closely related enough, now that they're not geographically separated, to interbreed. This is a zoo specimen, but they are known from the fact that here's a paper reporting recent hybridization between a polar and grizzly bear in the Canadian Arctic. So that's been observed and then genetic analysis done to confirm that these, so we're getting hybrid bears, which are called Pisleys or growler bears. But what the point is here, what we're dealing with is we've had two separate lineages going through time in evolution, and now they're becoming one lineage. So we're basically reconfiguring the tree of life. And a similar story, this is actually kind of cool, this is very recent, just came out. Here are two fairly familiar birds. This is the blue, or sort of, I should say, New World birds. This is the blue jay, quite handsome. And this is a green jay. This lives in this, I know them from around my home in Massachusetts. This is a temperate bird. This is a tropical bird. This is the green jay. Rather lovely, both of them. Now, for the first time, we've discovered this thing. This thing, it seems to have got the worst of both of them, actually. It's a rather drab species. This is a hybrid, so between the blue and green. So what's happened? So this is, so we're in southern US. This is Texas, part of Texas here. And here's the distribution of the blue, and here's the distribution of the green. The green, as the climate has been changing, has been moving north. Previously, they didn't encounter each other, but now, as you can see, they do. So, same story. Two separate lineages are now converged on each other and are one. So, climate change is rewriting the tree of life. Species redistribution. This is really just a grand word for so-called invasive species. This is huge, as you'd probably know, that by whether deliberately or inadvertently introducing species from different places, we're having highly deleterious impacts upon local flora and fauna. I'm going to start with an example where we don't actually have much of an evolutionary response to date, but which I think is very illuminating. The key idea I want to impart with this first example is the fact that the ecosystems are incredibly sensitive to manipulation to perturbation to change. A change in the ant inhabitants of a region of Africa has changed the predation relations between zebras and lions. So from ants to zebras to lions. So here we are in East Africa. This is in Kenya. These are acacia trees, and they're all the same species, and they span vast quantities of the African savanna. They are covering hectare upon hectare upon hectare. And what I want you to do is zoom in here. You can see there are these little blobs on these trees. Let's zoom in. These little blobs are built by the tree at the base of their spines. These are ant homes. So they're built by the tree to accommodate ants, and specifically to accommodate these guys. These are chromatic aster species, and you can see them in this photograph here. Okay, fine, that's nice. The plant has made a nice little home for the ants. What's going on? The ants get a home out of this. It's a mutualism. They also get some food from the plant and so on. Okay, so the ants have got something good. What do the plants get from the ants? Defense. Ants defend their plant. Remember, their plant is their resource, their friend. They defend the plant against herbivores. And yeah, you can think about how that would obviously work for, let's say, a caterpillar, because ants can obviously take down a caterpillar. But amazingly, these ants can prevent even giraffes, even elephants from eating these plants. So again, it's difficult to believe, and this will give you some sense. So this is a video. This will give you a very brief sense of, so somebody's just knocked this plant, and you can see the ants. Ants are frantically looking for things to bite and sting. And I know from experience they do bite and sting. Now, you're saying, yeah, fine, but these are ants. They're this size. How can they disturb an elephant? The answer, rather remarkably, it seems, is that they will, when the elephant reaches out with its trunk, which is a rather sensitive set of nostrils, right, they will run into the nostrils, bite and sting. That does not make for a happy elephant. So this is rather striking. What has happened is there is an invasive ant. This is a new ant has arrived on the block, and it's very different from chromatic aster. It's about the same size. It's also good at beating up other ants. So when it arrives, it beats up the chromatic aster, and the chromatic aster colonies die. They're eliminated from the plant, and the invading ant, Phydola megacephala, the big head ants, megacephala, take over the ant homes. Okay, fine, that's, a moment of ant warfare and the invaders have won. But the key thing here is that the invaders don't have the impulse to defend the trees. Okay, chromatic aster defends the trees heroically, as we've just discussed. Phydola does not. So what does that mean? I think this is really spectacular data. So what we've got is the proportion of these trees, these acacia trees, in a certain area, which have experienced damage by elephants. And when an elephant damages something, when it's so-called catastrophic damage, it basically rips the plant out of the ground, shreds it, eats the vegetation. It's killed the plant, okay? So catastrophic elephant damage is the end of the plant, all right? Now, let's look here. A large proportion of the the chromatic aster defended plants are completely unaffected. Elephants didn't get a look in, okay? So what is that? Something like 70% of the trees are essentially untouched by elephants. Now, what have we got? 17 or 18% of those with the megacephala ant in grey here have also not been damaged. But we're in increasing levels of damage as we move right along here to catastrophic. Very few defended plants are catastrophically damaged, but a fairly high proportion of the ones which are, quote, not defended by megacephala have been trashed. So that's the message, that with the chromatic aster ant, the plant is defended. With the invasive ant, it is not. So what does that mean in terms of the ecology of the system? Well, let's do an experiment. So here we have a forest of acacia inhabited by chromatic aster, the defending ant, and here we have a forest of acacia inhabited by the invasive, non-defending megacephala ant. And let's run the experiment by having, here comes the elephant. We'll have an elephant go through both populations. Now, thank you, elephant. What happens? This is largely unaffected. What about down here? Whoa. See what's happened? Basically, the landscape, the trees are killed. The landscape is utterly changed. Okay, but it's still East Africa and so on and so forth, you might say. Utterly changed. And this is where this study comes into play. Yes, we've got the switch of ants, and the consequences are extraordinary. Let's look at this. In the defended environment, there's lots of cover. Okay, there's lots of places to hide. Whereas in the invasive ant environment, there's not. So, and again, this is just a quantification of that visibility. Now, why does that matter? Well, because let's think about how lions hunt. Lions stalk their prey. They sneak up behind them. They are hiding, and then ambush, right? Now, and that's perfectly doable in this environment where we've got plenty of trees, okay? This is where the chromatic aster is doing its job. In this environment, where you've got megacephala in action, there's no trees, there's no cover, so you can't eat any zebras because the zebras see you coming a mile off. And you can actually quantify this, that there is a significantly higher probability of zebra kill if you're a lion, if you're in this environment with the chromatic aster ant rather than in the megacephala environment. Now, why do I linger on this story? It's because it makes the point that the natural world is this incredibly interconnected set of phenomena. Everything influences everything else. Who would have guessed that replacing one tiny little ant with another tiny little ant in the same place would have an impact upon the probabilities of lions killing zebras? I certainly wouldn't have, but that's the way the natural world works. That is why natural ecosystems are so sensitive to the introduction of species. So let's talk about an instance where we've had an introduced species and an evolutionary response. This is possibly the world's ugliest animal. It's the cane toad. It's native to South and Central America. And somebody had the bright idea of bringing it to Australia, introducing it to tropical Australia and Queensland in the 1930s. It wasn't irrational. The reason for this was the cane crop. This is sugar cane, which is a big export industry for Queensland, was being devastated by beetle pests. The larvae would eat the cane plants. So the hope was they could introduce this thing, which eats insect grubs, and that would clean up all their beetles, and the sugarcane would do fine, and the story would be happy. It was a disaster. The toads did not eat the sugarcane grubs, the beetles, they everything else, and they created a real problem because up here, this thing is a gland that is full of toxin. And anything that tried to eat the toad, and they're kind of tempting. I don't know about you, but that makes me hungry. Well, it doesn't. But that is a fat, happy toad. That's an introduced toad which is absolutely thriving in its new environment. These glands, full of toxins, kill native predators. So here's the spread. This was by 1960. It was still limited really to just coastal Queensland. Today, it's right through tropical wet Australia, and it's still on the march. This is an extremely successful introduced species. And as I've said, the bad news is the toxicity, especially because there are no native toads in Australia. So this is completely new. It's always the novelty piece that is going to stymie the existing ecosystem. So you've got predators look at these things, think, yum, take a bite of it, and then are literally poisoned. And snakes in particular have been very hard hit, including this one, probably one of the more common big toxic snakes in Australia, the red-bellied black snake. And so it eats frogs. And so it was obviously quite excited to encounter these toads, but they were being poisoned en masse. And there is data, it's largely anecdotal data, to suggest that their population is very hard hit by the arrival of the toad. Okay, the good news is that natural selection has kicked in. So the red-bellied black snakes have evolved to cope with this toxic toad. First thing to note here is we have red-bellied black snakes pretty much throughout Australia, whereas the toads are not throughout Australia. So there are populations in Australia of snakes which coexist with the toads, and there are populations of snakes which do not coexist with the toads. And so this is a simple experiment. If you take snakes from a population which coexists with a population of toads, and today, and give them a choice, do you want to eat a frog or a toad? They'll always go with it. Every time they go with a frog. Okay? In other words, they've either learned or they've evolved to avoid, these populations have evolved to avoid the toads. Now, that's not true if you've got a population where the toads are not cohabiting with them, so to speak. They've never seen toads before. They'll eat toads quite regularly, obviously with bad consequences. They still prefer frogs, but they'll eat the toads. Okay, so that's suggesting, one, there's been the evolution of toad evasion. Second thing, which is kind of interesting, because again, we've got good data on the spread of these animals over time, we can look at the amount of time that a snake population has been exposed to the toad, and ask about levels of resistance to the toxin produced by the toad. This is a slightly complicated process. What the researchers do actually is they actually dose snakes with some toxin and measure the extent to which their performance, this is swimming speed, these animals, snakes spend a lot of time in water, swimming speed is reduced. So the more reduced the swimming speed, the less resistance, the greater susceptibility. And what you can see here, there's a clear correlation between the amount of time that a population has been exposed. In other words, the amount of time the population have had a chance to evolve some level of resistance to the toxin vis-a-vis the time since they were first exposed, i.e. the toads arrived in their vicinity. So that looks like there are two separate strands of natural selection mediated response here. One, just to avoid toads, and two, to evolve resistance to the toad toxin. Now, you might well suggest that maybe the snakes are learning to avoid the toads, and that's obviously a reasonable conjecture. So this isn't an evolutionary response. So this is going back to the elephants. We had two categories of response. Remember, the PTSD was a learned response, and tusklessness was an evolved response. So you could argue, or people have argued, that maybe this is not a evolved response, but a learned one. But if you try and do experiments on snakes, this is what these experiments are. to see if snakes can learn to avoid. So this is a simple psychological experiment on snakes. Will a previous experience change subsequent behavior? That's what learning is. And the answer is no. These are not Einstein's snakes. So that tells us almost certainly that decision to avoid the toad prey is an evolved genetic change, not a acquired cultural change. Okay, getting towards the end, I want to point out it's all sort of grim and bad that I've talked about so far. There are responses to new opportunities as well. So there's a sort of upside to human impacts, including, weirdly, humans have affected the evolution of humans. And this is actually a famous and beautiful example. This is the evolution of lactase persistence or lactose tolerance. We humans have domesticated cattle probably 3 times. I might be out of date on the archaeology here, but we've got several independent domestications of cattle, and by not just cattle, but sheep and goats and so on, things you can get milk from. And this is a real breakthrough if you think about it. Milk is the perfect food for a growing baby. It's got everything, right? It's the only food the baby's getting. Okay, so if you can keep that going through later life, it's the perfect food for a 40-year-old, for a 50-year-old, for a 55-year-old, and so on, right? Well, yes and no, because the human system there's an enzyme called lactase, which breaks down the major sugar in milk, which is called lactose. Lactase is switched on for the first 2 years of your life when you're exposed to your mother's milk, okay? Then it's switched off. There's no point in producing lactase if there's no milk coming in, right? And historically, or at least prehistorically, there has been no milk coming in once you're weaned off your mother. But now, with dairy, you have the opportunity to have milk permanently. What does that mean? Strong natural selection in favor of keeping that lactase gene switched on, not just for the first 2 years, but for all for your entire life. So this is the evolution of lactase persistence, keeping it switched on, i.e. lactose tolerance. This is a rather technical way to look at it. It's actually a really cool study from a few years ago, in which what we could use so-called ancient DNA. This is where you can go back and sequence genomes from 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, and so on. This was looking at European populations, and they got a sample, I can't remember exactly, it's a sample from 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, 6,000, 5,000, 4,000, and so on. So you can basically track changes in mutations in allele frequencies over time. And so you can, what's going to change things most effectively? Natural selection. So this, again, is a rather complicated plot. What we've got is each human chromosome. So what we've measured here is essentially over a 10,000 year period, what has changed the most. And each dot is a gene, and we've got color-coded by chromosome. So the first few chromosomes are kind of big, and the latter ones are rather small. And the higher the points up here, the greater the difference between the beginning and end of that 10,000 year period, basically. Okay, so we're sort of doing a before and after project here and asking what's most different in the after. And we won't dwell on, we've got obviously a suite of interesting looking genes. What I want to draw your attention to is the winner in the entire human genome is this mutation. And it's a mutation that allows lactase persistence. So that's actually, it's really cool, because what we're doing, we've got a cultural innovation, dairy, and a biological response under natural selection to that cultural innovation. The best part of this is that we can see independent evolutions of lactase persistence in different populations. That's telling us clearly that natural selection must be involved. So here is this how it works. There's a lactase gene, so that produces the actual protein. This orange segment is the regulatory region of that gene, i.e. switching it on and off. And in crimson, I put this part of that regulatory switch, which specifies switch it on and off pre or post, at weaning time. So when we look, let's zoom in, when we look here and we look at, say, an African population, this is a pastoralist population with lactase persistence, we find a mutation. Basically, this mutation destroys the function of this crimson part of the gene. So there's the African mutation. Look at another population with lactase persistence. In Europe, same deal, we've got a mutation that disables the crimson area, but it's a different mutation. Tells us that those are two separate evolutionary events, but they've both been selected for because they're equally advantageous. They both have the same outcome, namely keeping the lactase gene switched on throughout life. Okay, so it's not just us who've benefited, if you like, from human activities. This is more rapid evolution, this time in this little bird. It's called black cap. And this is in a population in Europe. So the truly remarkable thing here is this is a bird that spends the summer in Europe and then heads south in the fall to Spain and North Africa to overwinter. It's too cold for it to spend the winter. There's not enough food for it over the winter in northern parts. So very common life cycle. What people saw, this is, so actually let's start here. This is the standard traditional activity. So here's a bird in Germany and it's starting to get cold. Where does it go? Well, it heads off south. People noticed that in Britain, of all places, birds started to overwinter. And what's more, these were German birds. So what has happened is, same story, once it starts to get cold, instead of heading south, it's heading west. Okay? What on earth is going on? Because the British is cold and damp and miserable like Germany, right? So this is what you might call irrational behavior on the part of the bird. No, it turns out that the selective conditions have been changed by humans in Britain. Turks love cats. They feed cats all the time. Brits love birds and they feed birds all the time. So I won't say every home, but an awful lot of homes have bird feeders. So weirdly, black caps do extremely well in Britain over the winter. So you've got a population which has evolved to switch, and this is genetically hardwired, the nervous underpinning of navigation of where and when to go, that is genetically determined. So there were mutations in that German population of black caps, some of which sent them west, which would normally be hopeless, right? Going in the wrong direction. But it turned out serendipitously that it was a great new resource, courtesy winter bird feeders. Okay, I'm going to finish with a slightly depressing prospectus. This is just to talk about what's especially sensitive to what we're doing to the environment, and those are island populations. And this is a truly demoralizing story, but it's worth bearing in mind. This, in the 1950s, this snake was introduced, it's called the brown tree snake, was introduced to the island of Guam, which is in, as you can see, the Western Pacific. There is one native species of snake on Guam, but it's blind, lives underground, and eats termites. So the other animals on Guam, which of course is an isolated island, had never encountered a snake before. So the effect on that native flora and fauna was absolutely devastating. And it happened too fast and too powerfully for evolution to intervene. Okay, so in a sense, the catastrophe is too extreme. It's overwhelmed any chance of a selective response. So, and famous example, 10 of Guam's 13 species of native forest birds snapped out. So there's one introduction catastrophic consequences. And the consequences on islands are particularly extreme because islands are so remarkable and interesting from an evolutionary point of view. Because they're isolated, all sorts of interesting things happen here. Hawaii, for example, this is a diversification of a group of little birds, collectively known as the Hawaiian honey creepers, which I think now were, until they started going extinct courtesy human and invasive species introductions, about 50 species. Absolutely spectacular. These are what we call endemics. They have evolved on Hawaii. They are unique to Hawaii. And they were just spectacular, interesting, and I think these species have already all tragically gone extinct. So islands are particularly sensitive. I've called them the epicenters of extinction. The dodo, as you know, was an island endemic. It lived on the island of Mauritius. It was flightless. European sailors, when they arrived, ooh, look at that, dinner, and the dodo didn't last long. But the reason islands are so important is because they're evolutionarily unique. You have all this so-called endemism. And again, as we discussed previously, but this is a different cause, you have a small population of a very large animal like a mammoth, but also on an island, even if you've got a small animal, it's going to have a small population because there's a very tiny amount of space. And finally, again, islands are often, they're cut off from the mainstream of evolution. And remember what we've said, it's when something completely new shows up, something completely alien, something that the resident flora and fauna are completely unprepared for, that problems arise. That's particular susceptibility to invasive species. So yes, islands are where the extinction danger lies. And this goes on a bit, I'm afraid, but it's an index of just how dire the situation is. This is an index of invasive species across a number of islands. And more demoralizing data, but again, placing the emphasis on islands. This is a summary of extinctions that we sort of have records of since 1600. And well, let's just look at this overall data. So we've got different groups here. Well, let's just look at the tally. We've lost about total of 855 species. So 855 documented extinctions. Remember, probably most extinctions aren't documented. We never knew about the thing. It's disappeared too late. But we've got 855 documented species, of which nearly 60% have occurred on islands. So think about that. I don't know, I'm going to make this up, but let's say the islands account for 0.01%, say 1/100th of 1% of the planet's terrestrial real estate, and yet they account for 60% of extinctions. So there you have it. I don't think there's any great controversy over the answer to the question I've asked in my title. The greatest evolutionary force in history? Absolutely, yes. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.